Our next speaker is Ms. Barbara Ryan. Ms. Ryan is the Associate Director for Geography at the U.S. Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia in the United States. Tonight, however, Ms. Ryan is here as the Chair of the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, or GCOS, which has for many years played a key role in coordinating the activities of space agencies and user organizations around the world. The Strategic Implementation Team of GCOS will meet this coming week at ESA's Esrin Center in Frascati, Italy. Ms. Ryan and several of her colleagues will be at that meeting. Her professional background involves studying geology and geography and civil engineering in the United States. She's served in a variety of increasingly responsible positions in USGS. I think she spent her whole career in USGS. And we're very grateful that Barbara Ryan has agreed to join us this evening to offer the GCOS perspective on this very important subject. Barbara Ryan.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it, and it's an honor, indeed an honor to be here. Let's see, I've got some slides that I'd like to put up on the screen. And Jose did a really good job of setting the stage for GEOS. And if you listened very carefully, what you heard is that GEOS has actually got two very important components, a satellite-based component and an in-situ component. So my remarks are going to be addressing the satellite component because over the last couple years, GEOS has essentially realigned its mission, its activities with the goals of GEO and GEOS. And then also, as he talked about 9 societal benefit areas, climate was one of those societal benefit areas. And so I'd like to also focus our remarks, although I've got some slides a little bit later on that talk about the broader issue of global change. These first couple slides are going to talk about GEOS's strategy for space-based climate observations. So just one slide that talks a little bit about GEOS. What you will see is a Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, actually established in 1984 from the Economic Summit of Industrial Nations. Why? Because even back then in 1984 there certainly was a recognized value for cross-disciplinary efforts, but a recognized need to better coordinate satellite missions. And there were two, at that time anyway, an outgrowth of 2 previous satellite coordination efforts. One for land observation satellites and then one for ocean observation satellites. What GEOS does, however, is operate through a best efforts organization of its members and associates via voluntary contributions, and as I talked about it, stepping forward to be the space segment provider of GEO. There is a brochure in, I guess, just outside as you were walking into the room, and so if you wanted to see a list of the members and the associates of GEOS, national space agencies, intergovernmental organizations on the order of 46 members, and those are listed on the back of this brochure if you happen to have it. Through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, there have been a number of actions that have evolved from the Conference of the Parties, the COPs 10, 11, and 12. Going back to the Conference of the Parties, COP 10, the nations that operate space agencies actually asked GEOS to in fact respond to something that the Global Climate Observing Strategy had put together. GCOS had in fact put together a plan, a set of requirements, very serious set of requirements, and looked to the space providers to in fact respond to that strategy or those sets of requirements. So it took the next meeting, COP11, for CEOS to actually accept that challenge, and then at the last conference of the parties, which was in Nairobi last year, CEOS actually delivered a report titled The Way Forward, Satellite Observation of the Climate System, the CEOS Response to the GCOS Implementation Plan. And so again, this brochure that's outside is actually the executive summary of the CEOS response to that climate strategy. The full report is only available on the web, but in that full report, what you will actually see is a response that covers the atmospheric domain, the oceanic domain, the terrestrial domain, and then a number of cross-cutting domains. And those cross-cutting issues might deal with just the continuity of global observations from the last 30 years to the present. It deals with the challenges that all nations are facing when we want to, in fact, transition research missions to operational missions. And those are the examples of some of the 59 actions that have been identified in this report. All of the 59 actions that have been identified are levied against space agencies of the world or our partners, and actually call for not only a major sustained satellite component as we look into the future, but also either additional resources where there are gaps, additional resources where there are likely to be gaps, and then just to maybe head off one question from the audience about, well, what do you mean by additional resources? Because the resources that any of our countries have are in fact the resources that we have. And so I think I might argue again, and Jose alluded to this in his remarks, about bringing ministers to the table. We're really talking about priorities that governments use, whether it's, now of course we would like additional resources in this effort, but the argument has to be made on priorities and the need for these resources to be spent in this particular area. Just real quickly, and I know this is quite detailed, but I think it's important to show something called the 26 essential climate variables that have been identified in the GCOS report. You will see them listed under atmospheric, oceanic, and terrestrial domains. But I think the very important part about a slide like this is that for the last 20, maybe 30 years, we really have had a remarkable record of measuring these variables in this issue for climate change, I argue broadly for global change, and for a whole number of reasons around the world. I think we are in jeopardy of walking away from this remarkable record that we have had for the last 20 or 30 years. Now, do you need more, and has more needed to be done? Most certainly, but what this report calls for is more attention to these variables and actions that space agencies can take to in fact continue the record of these variables. One other action as a follow-up to continuity of those variables is something that CEOS has taken on its agenda for the last couple years, something called a constellations concept, our virtual constellations concept. And again, we are doing this to in fact meet the GEO objectives and goals that Jose talked about. There are 4 constellations: land surface imaging, ocean surface topography, atmospheric composition, and global precipitation. Why? Because if space agencies from around the world can in fact look at synergies that can exist among and between their assets, these are 4 very important areas that then will tie back to those essential climate variables that we saw on the previous slide. What would these constellations do? Establish common guidelines, optimal end-to-end capabilities, and really coordinated user requirements for these future systems, all things that are embedded in the GEO goals that Jose talked about. Just real quickly, a couple slides to just end with. This happens to be Landsat 7, so a U.S. asset for land imaging. The colors denote the number of scenes that have been collected from this particular satellite and are now housed in a global archive. Clearly, you'll see red over the United States, the bias because it's a U.S. asset. But I think the other thing to show is even at the poles, and the blue color on this graph shows anywhere from 1 to 30 scenes that have been collected from Landsat 7 and are in the archive. There are few places over the globe that we do not have some Landsat data, maybe right at the North Pole and right at the South Pole. But if we go to the next slide, it actually shows for me the value of an archive. What you happen to see here are two pictures of urban growth. Again, a U.S. city. This happens to be Las Vegas. The first slide on the left-hand side is a Landsat image from, I don't know, 1972, 1973, when Landsat 1 was first launched. The population in Las Vegas at that time was, I think it was about 300,000 people. The slide on the right is a Landsat 7 image from about maybe 2002 or 2003. The population in Las Vegas now is 1.5 million people. So over about a 30-year time span, a five-fold increase in population. And yet with Landsat, the value of the archive was that you could go back and see what was 30 years ago. So as we talk about whether it's climate change or global change, with a global acquisition strategy, you are not actually targeting your collections for some very specialized need, although that's very important as we look at tsunami damage or earthquake damage. But if we do in fact want to look at global change, you don't know where the next disaster is going to occur, but you will always want to look at what it looked like before that particular disaster. And so again, the value of an archive. So in this case, another urban area, this happens to be Tucson, Arizona. What you happen to see here is INSAR data that was collected from NVSAT, looks at subsidence due to groundwater withdrawal in the Tucson area. So again, as population grows, we could use satellite data like this to look at other measures of global change. And the very last slide, there's a lot of words on this particular slide, but if you do happen to have a copy of the CS brochure, on the very last page, for me I think this is so very critical for our community. In conclusion, CS recognizes that both satellite and in situ data are required to better monitor, characterize, and predict changes in the Earth system. While in situ measurements will remain essential, absolutely essential, and largely measure what cannot be measured from satellites, Earth observation satellites are the only realistic means to obtain the necessary global coverage, and with well-calibrated measurements will become the single most important contribution to global observations for climate. We absolutely need, as GEOS is in fact proposing, both in situ measurements and satellite measurements. We need in situ measurements to do a better job of tying in our satellite observations, but for any country in the world, we are never going to put in situ measurements in place for every inch of this globe. We have to have something that will in fact connect those interstices between those in situ measurements and satellites, whether they are in fact civil satellites on the government side or private sector satellites, are going to be very, very essential for studying global change. Thank you very much.